focused and see how well we can, or how far we can get with all of this. Just trying to move things around on my screen a little bit because sometimes things disappear. All right. Some of you who do Zoom know how if you get too many windows open, you don't know where you're at anymore. So today we're going to begin Unit 2. In the first unit, just in review, we talked about Paul's life, his travels. Most of that information we can get in the book of Acts, or there are a couple of places in Paul's letters that are called autobiographies. Auto in Greek means like myself, and then biography, bios is the word for life. So it's where someone tells about his or her own life. So there are a couple of passages in Paul's letters where he talks about his own life. And then we add that to the book of Acts and we get good background of what Paul did. Now we're going to tackle the next topic, which is Paul, the letter writer. We think of Paul in different ways. In the early church, like after Paul, in the second century, people thought of Paul as a missionary, as a church planter. Today, we tend to think about Paul as a theologian. But really, Paul was a pastor and a missionary, and he wrote letters to people. The letters help us understand what he thought, and they give us good insights into the early church. 1 second. I need to get a little cough drop because my throat still feels ticklish. Okay, that'll help a little bit. Okay, and so we know a lot about Paul's thoughts because of the letters he wrote. Now we can learn about Paul, the letter writer. It is helpful when we read and interpret Paul's letters, not just simply to open the Bible and, just kind of like theologize. You know what I mean by that? Theologize. And we just open it up and we try to read it as if it's speaking to us without considering the background and the purpose of the letters. It's important and very helpful for us to understand not just simply what Paul said, but how he said it. Why did he write the way he did? Point number 1, introduction to Pauline literature. Now, the next couple of topics are maybe a bit academic, but they're helpful as far as our background understanding goes. The extent of the literature. The word extent in English means how far or how much literature. How far does the literature go? What does it include? Paul wrote the first accounts we have about Jesus. Romans, Galatians, and Corinthians reveal a lot about Paul's theology and are considered major letters. There are some things we do not know about Paul's thought, such as what he knew about the historical Jesus. For example, Paul was a young man in Jerusalem in the early church in Acts chapter 8. Was Paul in Jerusalem when Jesus was there? Did Paul actually ever see Jesus or hear Jesus speak in the temple courts? It's possible that he did. But he never gives us any hint that he heard the teachings of Jesus. Just because some idea is not in his letters does not mean he did not think it. He also mentions things in his letters we cannot understand, but his original readers may have known. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 29, he talks about baptism for the dead. What does that mean? Well, interpreters ever since then have tried to figure that out, and we really do not know what Paul meant by that. But we can assume that probably the Corinthians knew what he was talking about. Number 2, Paul wrote other letters that we do not have and did not survive. For example, there is a letter mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is not 1 Corinthians. Does that make sense? 1 Corinthians is not the first letter Paul wrote to Corinth. It's probably at least the second letter. The first letter is gone. We don't know where it's at. So in the first canonical letter of 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions a letter he wrote earlier to them. Well, that letter is lost. We don't know what that is. Ignatius of Antioch wrote to the Philippians. Ignatius, early 2nd century Christian. He said, Paul wrote in many letters to the Philippians. Well, we only know of one letter that he wrote. So Ignatius thinks that Paul wrote several other letters to the Philippians. I imagine that Paul wrote a lot of letters, and some of them did not survive over the years. Paul's letters were collected and arranged from the longest to the shortest. The purpose of this was for buying parchments for copying the manuscript. The Epistle to the Hebrews was added in the early centuries to the Pauline collection as a 14th book. But many scholars today do not think that Paul wrote the Epistle to the Hebrews. There are some interesting overlaps between Hebrews and Paul's letters, but there's also some significant differences. So most people do not think that Hebrews was actually written by Paul. And in this class, we will not treat it as a Pauline epistle. It's usually studied as a general epistle. Now we come to a challenging question. There's a debate about which letters actually came from Paul. There are some so-called disputed letters, and this would be those letters that some of the critical scholars do not think Paul wrote for various reasons. And each of these, it gets pretty complex, and we're not going to look at these individually. But if you're interested, you can always go and read a commentary on any one of these letters in the beginning, and they'll talk about authorship. So Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus are called the disputed letters. The questions focus on how some of the thought is different from the undisputed letters, whether Paul wrote the letters or if someone wrote in his name after he died. How much scribes changed the content? Paul used secretaries, and the technical term for that is called amanuensis. And so Paul would dictate the letter, and someone would write it down for him. He did not actually write with his own hand. Probably he had poor handwriting, I don't know. But we find out, for example, that Tertius wrote Romans, according to Romans chapter 16, verse 22. Paul dictated to Tertius, who wrote it down. And there's also a mention in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 21, that suggests that Paul dictated orally the letters and someone wrote them down. Did the secretaries influence the wording and the writing style, or did they add any content? That we can't answer that question. What influence the co-authors had in letters? For example, many of Paul's letters are not just from him. We call them Pauline letters, and he's the primary author, but there's other people with him. For example, 1 Corinthians was written with Sosthenes. 2 Corinthians with Timothy. Galatians has all the brothers and sisters with Paul. Philippians, Timothy. Colossians was with Timothy. 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians were both with Silas and Timothy. Interesting that Timothy was with Paul in 5 of his letters. Timothy is called the co-author. How much input did these other people have in the actual writing of the letter? We don't know. It's hard to tell. But in all of these letters, Paul is the primary authority. It's his voice that we hear. There are some reasons why the scholars dispute the Pauline authorship of these letters. For example, vocabulary. It's hard to see that in English translation, but in Greek, you can see that some letters use specific words that are not found in other letters. Writing style and sentence structure sometimes is a little different. Theological concepts are different. There's a lack of theological concepts in the disputed letters that are found in the authentic letters. And the language tends to become more traditional, meaning that it seems like it's more like someone is taking Paul's thoughts and kind of formulating them into theology. Another question is on whether letters have been edited and combined. For example, 2 Corinthians, we'll just look at that in a week or two. It seems like that letter has different sections to it that don't really fit together. It's as if someone took 2 different letters and glued them together. And scholars debate anywhere from 2 to 5 different letter fragments. Philippians, there seems to be 3 fragments according to some people, and a big change when it comes to chapter 3. And Romans 16 stands out in the whole letter. And there's a list of names that in a place where Paul never has been yet. He never was in Rome, but he knew a lot of people there. So here's a conclusion. There are possible reasons for each of the above points that does not necessarily go against Pauline authorship. Issues of authorship do not lower the authority of these letters for us as God's inspired word. Let me just say this simply. When it comes to the authorship of Paul's letters, I tend to take the more conservative approach and assume that the early church got it correct and that all of those letters were indeed written by the historical Paul of Tarsus. And so I accept the traditional perspective that these letters are all by Paul. That doesn't mean that I ignore the challenges, but I do not waste my time and I do not lose any sleep over the issue of authorship. It is just a helpful thing to realize and to know if you're going to go to the library sometime and read the commentaries, because sometimes they will talk about these issues. Well, if it's a good commentary, they will talk about these issues. Let's move on to another important topic, and that is that Paul wrote to deal with specific situations. This is important to know because every letter that he wrote it to deal with some kind of issue, some kind of problem or question that a church or a person had. Our goal as interpreters is to try to understand why Paul wrote what he did. What's the reason? What problem is he dealing with? And in most of his letters, he deals with multiple problems. Point number 1, he wrote with clear purposes. These purposes are clear in most cases, but often there are multiple purposes for a letter. The purpose for a letter is usually given at the beginning. And I'll point this out when we get into the letters. But usually after the Thanksgiving section of a letter, the next part will give the thesis or the purpose of the letter. Paul wrote to real churches and situations. He was not writing theory. He did not sit down to write a theology paper. He wrote to real people who had real questions and issues. He did not write abstract theology. He had no idea that people centuries later would read his letters and study them so closely. We do not have all of his complete thought on various topics, but we get glimpses of how he applied his thought to specific situations. This makes understanding his whole theology challenging. We have to look at individual passages and then piece them together with other passages to get a fuller understanding of the whole of his thought. For example, in one book, he might talk about justification by faith or works of the law. For us to understand that well, we need to go to his other letters and see what he says about that topic as well. There's some letters that where he only deals with the topic in that letter. For example, it's only in 1 Corinthians that Paul talks about speaking in tongues. He doesn't mention that anywhere else, which raises a lot of other questions that we can talk about when we get to 1 Corinthians. We'll look at each of the letters, and you may have questions at that time about the contents. Number 2, Paul wrote as a pastor and spiritual mentor. He shows his authority by returning to a church with a personal visit. If he could, he would go back and visit the church. He would send a messenger who came with his authority. For example, he would send Titus or Epaphroditus or Timothy or other people. He would send them back to the church to check on the situation. And if he could not do one or two, or sometimes if he could do A or B, he would also send a letter. And the letter represents his presence. And the letter would have the same authority as if he was there himself. The letters are really a dialogue, a conversation between Paul and the church. Sometimes we can even see questions that the church may ask Paul, and then Paul answers them back. And there's a technical word for that called diatribe, but we won't worry about that. Ancient letters were often seen as written speeches and show many characteristics similar to rhetorical communication. Paul's letters were written to churches and intended to be read out loud, I should say here. They were intended to be read out loud when the churches met together. Why did Paul write letters? Well, number 1, he wanted to check up on the churches. As a pastor, he couldn't be there in person, so he would write a letter to check up on them and to offer his ideas and counseling and exhortation, commands. Number 2, to train the churches in Christian doctrine. And the technical word for that is called catechesis, or you might be familiar with the term catechism. Paul would be the teacher, and he would be teaching the churches. Because he could not be there in person, he would teach them doctrine and about the gospel. Number 3, to show how the gospel of Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. There are many places in Paul's letters where he quotes the Old Testament. And so he shows the readers how Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Number 4, he wrote to correct and warn against false teaching. Many of his letters, he will correct heresy. False teachers had come to many of the places where he had been, especially those who were legalistic Jews, Jewish Christians. And they would preach things like the Gentiles would have to be circumcised, or they would have to follow certain regulations or certain holidays. And Paul wrote to correct that wrong understanding. And then number 5, to show how Christians should live in their cultural context. A lot of his letters, he will give what are called vices and virtue lists. And so he would tell the churches how they should live in their pagan, ungodly environment. As we get into his letters, just go back and review these ideas, and it will help you when you come to an individual passage. Now, when I used to read Paul's letters, when I was in college and even in seminary, I would get confused. You know, his letters did not make very much sense to me. I mean, you know, I could get a little bit out of the theology and, you know, the ethics, you know, the commands and vices and virtues, you know, fruit of the Spirit. I can understand all of that. But there were many places in Paul's letters where I just had a hard time. I didn't really understand what was going on. What helped me a lot is what I talk about in this next section. And so I would suggest to you that this is very, very helpful background in this next section. Some of it will get very technical, and I would not expect you to understand all of it at this point in your studies, but you could go on and study this more in the future if you like. And the more that you study these topics about how Paul wrote, the more you will understand what he wrote. Does that make sense? We need to understand how he puts his words together in order to understand the meaning of those words. Probably the majority of Christians just open the Bible and just start reading it and somehow hope that it applies to their life. But they miss the whole background of what Paul is trying to say. The genre of letter. Now, the word genre is a word used in biblical studies for literary type, okay? Don't get too worried about the technical stuff, but it's called the literary type. The Bible has many different literary types: poetry, history, genealogy lists, laws. Well, Paul wrote in the genre of letters. His letters are similar to other letters of that time. You know, just like today, I remember when I was in school, maybe high school, we learned how to write business letters. A business letter would be where you have, like, you give the date and the probably like the address, and then you say, "Dear so-and-so," and then you give like an introduction, and then you tell them what the request is. And then at the bottom of the page, you say "sincerely" or "best wishes" or whatever, "yours truly." No, you don't say that in a business letter, do you?
No, that's a love letter.
That's a love letter, yeah. So a business letter, you say "sincerely," and then you sign your name. Well, that's kind of like a style of letter. Well, back in the first century, there was also a style of letter writing. The style of letter writing was similar to the oral speeches that people would give. Now, obviously, back then, they didn't have movies and TVs. Instead of that, people would go out to the marketplace and listen to people talk. We get our talking heads on the screen these days. But in the old days, people would go and listen to someone give a speech. and that was a form of entertainment and news and information and teaching. Those speeches had certain parts to them, and they had certain, you could tell very clearly, if you knew, what to look for, you can tell what that person is saying and how that fit into the whole speech. And so if we can understand those different parts to an ancient speech, which are found in ancient letters, it will help us understand what Paul is saying in a certain place in his letter. Paul's letters are longer than most letters of the ancient world. For example, 1 Corinthians or Romans, those are very long letters. A more typical letter would be something like Philemon, which would be like, just one page. Paul's letters were long letters. His letters cover many topics and have many nuanced arguments intended to persuade his readers to follow his directions. There were two major types of ancient letters. There were the official letters. This would be like if a head of state would write an official looking letter. And then there were informal personal letters. And Paul follows that pattern. His letters are more of the informal personal type letter. As I said a moment ago, the ancient letters had different parts to them. And we can see these parts in Paul's letters. Now, not every letter follows exactly the pattern. Paul did not have opened in front of him his rhetorical grammar, how to write a letter textbook. He didn't have a template in front of him that he followed. It was more like this is just the way people talk. This is the proper way of writing a letter. And he just knew that. And so in the different parts of his letters, we see these. The letter will start off with a salutation. And this has three parts to it. You can turn to any of Paul's letters and you can find this. First of all, we have the sender's name. And so all of Paul's letters start off with his name, Paul, the apostle. Sometimes he will give a description of himself. Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus. There's usually some kind of relationship of Paul to Jesus mentioned at the beginning of his letters. And then he also will mention his co-author. So I just opened up Colossians. It's a fairly short one. Actually, if you have your Bibles, let's turn to Philemon because that's short and it has most of the parts of a letter. We can just keep it on one page. So if you open up the letter to Philemon, we get this, at the first thing we get the sender, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus. Well, that's fairly significant in itself. And then we get the co-author, Timothy, our brother. So Timothy was with Paul when he wrote this. So this letter is actually from two people, but Paul is the primary voice of the letter. The next part is the recipient. And this could be both churches or individuals. Remember, the last four letters of Paul are written to individuals. 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Those are individual letters. The other 9 are written to a church. Well, in Philemon, it says, to Philemon, our beloved brother and fellow worker, and to Apphia, our sister, and to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. Well, Philemon is the primary person, but there's actually 4 groups mentioned in this letter. It's addressed to 4 people: Philemon, Apphia, Archippus, and the church. The next part is a greeting. Now, most of Paul's greetings are the same or very similar. Grace and peace, or grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. They may be a little different, but Paul almost always, I think, he will say grace and peace. Now, for us, we probably would interpret that theologically. I think that's what Paul intended. But it is interesting that these two greetings were actually how Greeks and Jews greeted one another. So the word for grace is closely related to the word for the greetings, hello, in Greek. So in Greek, someone would say chairein, which would basically means rejoice, be happy. How are you doing? Well, the Greek word for grace is charis. Slightly different spelling, but very similar. So Paul changes that Greek greeting into a Christian greeting about grace. And peace is the typical greeting among Jews. They would say shalom. In the Middle East today, they may say salem. It's almost like, it's almost come into Tagalog, I think, salamat, very similar. And so Paul takes the Jewish and Greek greeting and gives theology and grace and peace. That's what we need. That's what people are looking for, but they don't know where to find it. And this grace and peace comes from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. God is the source of this grace and peace. The next section of the letter is the Thanksgiving section. This follows the salutation. Interestingly, the Thanksgiving is missing in Galatians, 2 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, and Titus. In each of those letters, Paul is dealing with difficult churches who are giving in to false teaching. So maybe that's why he skips the Thanksgiving, because there's not a lot to be thankful for. But anyway, he gives a little bit different in each of those letters. But typically, in most letters, he will mention thanksgiving or prayer. In Philemon, it says, I thank my God always, making mention of you in my prayers. And that really continues. His thanksgiving really, in a way, continues all the way to verse 9. But perhaps we could shorten it to verse 6, because that's all one sentence. But it's usually a whole paragraph. His thanksgiving is a whole paragraph. Paul's thanksgivings often contain a prayer to God, a statement of relationship, and sometimes irony. Irony is a word that means you say one thing, but you mean just the opposite. For example, Paul gives thanks to God in 1 Corinthians for the very problems that he's going to deal with in the letter. I'll probably say this when we get to the individual letters, but Paul often mentions that he prays for the churches. He prays always for them, often for them. He had a prayer list, and prayer was a very important part of his ministry. He could not be with these people in person, but he could pray for them. That's why he often mentions prayer. Then we come to a more challenging part of Paul's letters, and that's the body of the letter. That would be the big chunk, the big part of the letter. This part of the letter contains the main themes and follows Greco-Roman rhetoric and the parts of a speech. I have in the notes the Latin terms. These are used now by Bible scholars. Most of these are fairly easy to take into English because English words directly come from these. But I would say do not get too lost or worried about these technical terms. You may come across them in some of the better technical commentaries. In a speech, the introduction after the Thanksgiving is called the exordium, and this gives the purpose of the letter. It focuses the attention of the audience and gains their goodwill. Not every letter of Paul will have each of these components or in this order. In Philemon, probably, I would say maybe verses 7 through 9 could be the exordium. Narratio displays the facts of the case, usually gives some kind of background, and is brief and clear. We can see that especially in 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, I've heard reports that from Chloe's people that there are divisions among you, and I can believe it. That's basically what he says. That's called the narratio, the narration. He's giving the facts of the case, the background, what he's heard. And then sometimes there might be a digressio. We get the word digression. A digression is what a pastor does when he's preaching and goes off topic for a while. Maybe tells a story. So a digression, it seems like the author is kind of going off on a tangent, maybe going off on a topic that's not really related. And these can show up, in different places in the letters. The propositio, think of it as a proposition or the thesis of the speech or the letter. In Philemon, I would probably say verse 10 is the thesis. I appeal to you for my child Onesimus. It's the first time that the name Onesimus is mentioned. This is why Paul is writing. He is appealing to Philemon in behalf of Onesimus. The probatio contains the proofs based on the credibility of the author and appeals to the hearer's feelings or logical argument. Paul does that a lot in this letter. He appeals to Philemon's, how do we say it? His Christian faith. And you can see that throughout the letter. Paul is, he's bringing up topics, especially in this next paragraph. He will bring up topics that, in a way, it kind of puts a little bit of guilt on Philemon. He's kind of putting a little pressure on Philemon to accept Onesimus back. And you could probably call that the probatio part of the letter. The confirmatio, the main body of the discourse or argument, and this may contain paranesis, which is moral exhortation. We would simply say commands. Paul gives commands. And refutatio, which is a refutation, that's where you give the opposite view in the worst possible way. That is where you take the false teacher's ideas and you show how wrong they are. Well, in some places, Paul will say that in the last days, there's going to be false teachers, or sometimes he brings up names and he shows that these people are wrong. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he talks about the super apostles. And basically, he is putting them in the worst possible way so that the Corinthians will realize, no, we should not follow those false apostles. We need to follow the true gospel that Paul has preached. And then the peroratio would be the conclusion to the speech, when the speaker summarizes and gives alternatives to his argument and seeks to arouse the hearer's emotions. I'm not sure exactly where that might fit in the book of Philemon, but probably towards verse 21. That's probably a good peroratio where he kind of winds up his topic. And then the letters will have some kind of closing. And in the closing, there would be a blessing, a greetings, final exhortation, a kiss, a benediction. Not necessarily all of those things, but usually some of those things. In this letter, we have greetings, directions in chapter or verse 22, to prepare a house, a place for him to stay. Greetings in verses 23 and 24. And then we have the closing blessing in verse 25. This is a very short letter. It's a little more difficult to analyze, individual parts. I would say do not get too worried about trying to analyze a letter and say, oh, this must be the propositio or the probatio or whatever. No, there are some commentaries that will do this, and it's very helpful. I have one in my library by Ernst Best. I think I have his on Galatians, and he structures his whole commentary based on these. And so he was actually one of the first to kind of see how this lays out in Paul's letters. But one thing that you may find helpful is you can ask yourself, especially in the beginning part of the letter, why does Paul have this part? And then he shifts to a new topic and to a new topic. I find it especially helpful to look for the thesis of the letter. You can usually find this right after the Thanksgiving section. And I'll point this out when we get to the letters. We'll probably be doing that next week, start with the letters. But if you could find that's kind of like why he's writing. What's the reason? What is his purpose? That's usually in chapter 1, usually right after the Thanksgiving section. I'll go on to letter D now. Paul and ancient letter writing. Paul used whatever parts of ancient letter writing that would fit the purpose of his particular letter. He did not, as I would say, he did not sit down and try to follow his template he learned in high school, because that was the topic in high school, was rhetoric, and into college. That was a very important part of the education. It is clear that Paul was schooled in that. He knew it. And his letters are obviously someone who went to some kind of education and knew the ancient parts of a letter and a speech. But rather, he wrote and he just drew upon whatever sources and styles that would meet his purpose. He used an amanuensis, as I shared earlier, or a scribe and secretary. Only the last part of certain letters does he write himself as a form of signature. We see this at the end of Galatians. For example, well, we have Philemon open. It says in verse 19, I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay it. So he picks up the pen and he writes it in his own hand. Many people think that maybe his eyesight was not too good or his handwriting was not too good. Galatians 6:11, he says, see with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. So perhaps at the close of this letter, he picked up the pen and said, here, let me write the last part. It's kind of like if I were to write a letter, my handwriting has gotten very messy. Paul probably wrote with big letters when it came to the last part. It was more of a signature. At the end of 1 Corinthians, chapter 16, verse 21. It says, the greetings is in my own hand, Paul. So again, it looks like he picks up the scribal pen and he writes the last part with his own handwriting. And we can see that in other places. At the end of Colossians, the end of 2 Thessalonians, and then Philemon. His letters were intended to be read out loud publicly to the whole group, to the whole church. There's an interesting thing about that. If you read a letter in front of everybody, everyone is going to be listening, and it means that now it's public information. It puts a lot of social pressure on everyone, and now they need to follow Paul's letters. It's not like you can go read the letter in a quiet closet and no one else knows what it's about. No. For example, the letter to Philemon was written to the whole church. Now, Philemon may have been part of either the Colossian church or the Laodicean church, or at least he had a house church. And so he was from that general area. By reading that letter out loud, everyone in the church is going to be watching Philemon and how he responds to his runaway slave Onesimus. The order of the letters. The letters are grouped generally by size, from the longest to the shortest, and they're grouped in two categories, to the churches and to individuals. We've talked about that already. There are different types of letters. There are some letters that are highly theological. Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. We get a lot of Paul's theology in those letters. And that means they're not very easy to understand sometimes. Another group is called the Christological Letters, because they tell us a lot about Jesus. Christology. Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. These are also called the prison epistles, since they were all written from prison. And then there are two eschatological letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Eschatology means about the end times. In these two letters, Paul deals with the topic of Jesus' second coming. And then there are ecclesiastical letters. Ecclesiology has to do with the church. 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. These are also called the pastoral letters or pastoral epistles. All right, let me pause before we go on. Does anyone have any questions so far? Is this making sense to you? Do you understand some of the key ideas? This will be background. So when we actually get to the letters, you can come back here and hopefully it'll make more sense to you. Any questions so far?
Dr. David?
Yes.
Yeah, I just have a question. Let me go back to the notes. With regard to the salutation, you mentioned that the style of writing of Paul at that time is he gives his name at the beginning of the letter. So if we are going to compare it now, during Paul's time, whenever they write letters, so they usually begin with the name of the writer, as in the signature block. Unlike now, like when we write during our time, it's like Dear David, and then you write the body of the letter, and then in Christ, Christine. But during the time of Paul, is it done the other way? They say their name first, they say the name of the writer first. Is it just Paul, or was it the common practice by everyone during that time?
Yes, this is the common practice. So the pattern we see in Paul's letters, he did not invent that. He's following the way that people typically read or wrote letters. The reason we know that is because there are many letters that have been discovered from the ancient world. And they're called papyri, made from papyrus and other things. Many of them have been discovered, and so that's where a lot of these, like these terms and so on, came from. There are actually handbooks that were like teaching manuals. These were the textbooks that people had, and they were written by people like Aristotle and Cicero and other people. They perfected this. This was like their English or Tagalog lesson, was to learn this. And so this is how you wrote letters. So you start with your name and then who you address it to. Yeah, it's interesting. You can look up on the internet. I don't know where right now, but you can look up ancient letters and you can probably find some.
Yeah. Would you have any idea as to when it changed?
Oh, no, I don't know for
Okay.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the history of modern letter writing. But, 100 years ago or 150 years ago, people learned rhetoric. That was one of the topics in school. Somehow it kind of transitioned into like grammar and other things, but people learned how to give speeches. Maybe you took a speech class in school and you had to stand up and give a speech. Well, we do the same thing today. We just practice a different form of rhetoric. Also, when I studied these things, it helped me a little bit in my own preaching. Because, if you can learn how other people communicate, it helps you in your own communication. So that, if you make a sermon, you want to make it halfway organized and not just kind of like jump all over the place. It's also helped me in my writing too. I want my writing to be organized and clear. Yeah, so if you study these things, it will help you in your own communication. Modern rhetoric is different than Greco-Roman rhetoric, but there's a lot of similarities. Yeah. Other questions?
I have a question. Is there any style difference between the letters Paul writes to primarily Jewish congregations and primarily Gentile congregations?
Well, first of all, you have to establish the fact that he wrote to different congregations. And probably, in my thinking, almost all of his letters were written to mixed congregations. And some of them were probably a little more heavy towards the Gentile. But places like the letter to the Romans was written to both Jews and Greeks because they were both in the church. Now, a lot of what Paul writes in Romans addresses a Jewish problem, but a lot of what he says is applicable to Gentiles. So I don't think the style of writing really changes according to the audience, because I think most of the churches were a mix of Jew and Gentiles, or at least in some places even more heavily Gentile, who were trying to be forced to be Jews, like Galatians. There probably were some Jews in those places because there were Jews in most major cities, but probably Galatians tends to be heavily Gentile. I think Paul even says he might even just address them as Gentiles. I'd have to go back and look at that. But anyway, yeah. So I think Paul's letters are fairly consistent in the type, in the structure, and how he writes. I'm not sure how ancient Jews would write letters, so that would be an interesting thing to study. Again, one of the problems we run into is that there are not a lot of ancient sources that are available, because of time. They disappear over time, unless they were copied, centuries later. But it's not like we can go into the library and get a whole book of ancient Jewish letters, But there are some that are known and can be copied, or that were copied over and passed on from generation to generation. Yeah, I used to have a book in my library, but I gave it away when I moved here from the Philippines. And I think I gave it to one of the Bible college libraries about Paul the letter writer. Yeah, I gave away about half my books. So sometimes I think, I wish I had that book. But anyway, There are some really good books if you go to a library. Like if you're close to APNTS, they have some really good books on Paul the letter writer. There's one that, let's see, what's his name? Oh, okay. No, Shan. No. I forget his name right now. But there's some really good books on Paul the letter writer. You see, this topic of rhetoric and Paul's letter style of writing became a big topic about 40 years ago, 30 to 40 years ago in biblical studies. And there were a lot of books that came out dealing with this topic. So a lot of scholars wrote about that topic. Yeah. Well, let's go on to number 3, Paul's letters as rhetoric. Now, the term rhetoric, according to the ancient philosopher Aristotle, is the art of persuasion. Rhetoric is how you try to convince someone of your ideas. Basically, most communication is some kind of rhetoric. When we stand up in the pulpit, I try to convince the church that what I'm saying is true and they should listen to it and change their life. As I teach, maybe not so heavy and convincing, but I want you to learn and to accept what I say as true. So I'm practicing a form of rhetoric right now. When you talk to, let's say you're a mother or father, and you talk to your child, you're using a form of rhetoric. Sometimes you have to use very strong rhetoric. And so you might use your voice. You might use certain words. And so all of those are a form of rhetoric or convincing. Now, as I mentioned before, the people in the first century developed handbooks, textbooks basically, that had rules that people needed to follow if they were going to give a speech. And those rules became, quite elaborate, and they've been discovered and passed down, and you can go read up on them if you want. But Paul's letters show many similarities with Greco-Roman rhetoric, but he adapted this to get across his message of Jesus Christ. One thing we can ask ourselves when we study Paul's letters is, what is he trying to convince the readers to accept? What is he trying to convince them of? By answering that question, we will understand the purpose of the letter that he wrote. And there may be multiple purposes for that. There were 3 major types of ancient rhetoric, and these can be mixed up, and we see these all in Paul's letters. Judicial rhetoric, so-called, has to do with language of the law court. And it's where the author tries to convince the readers of the rightness or wrongness of their past action. There are places where Paul takes the readers to court. Very strong judicial rhetoric. For example, I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians chapter 4. And in that chapter, Paul calls God as witness. God is Paul's witness. And because the Corinthians were accusing him of being wrong and things like that. And so very strong judicial rhetoric. It's like you're in court. Another type of rhetoric is called deliberative. This tries to persuade or dissuade, which is the opposite, certain individuals concerning the urgency of a future action. So they need to change because of something that's going to happen in the future. And then epideictic is very common in Paul's letters. He uses praise or blame to urge people to affirm a point of view or a set of values in the present. Sometimes Paul will just come out clear and he says, I write this to shame you. He wants his readers to feel bad about their actions so that they will change. So this is a favorite of Paul. He loves to use this form of rhetoric to shame or blame his readers. In today's thinking, we might say we say something to convict the reader or perhaps the congregation. And it's so we might use, some of the same words, but it's how you say it, how you put the words together. Judicial, I might say, I cannot believe that you think I did this, that I'm wrong. God knows that I'm right. I call God as my witness. My conscience is clear before God. Deliberative rhetoric. That you should change the way you live now because judgment is coming. And we will have to stand before the throne of God and give an accounting. Jesus is coming again, so we need to be ready when he comes. That's kind of deliberative rhetoric. And then epideictic is, I'm writing this to shame you so that you will change your behavior. You have been living in the wrong way. You have been living as fleshly, worldly people who are giving into sin. And so you need to feel bad about that and change your perspective and be in a place of honor before God. So, there's different words, and I would not worry too much about trying to categorize Paul's letters, but this just helps explain why he writes differently sometimes. He has this way that people would talk. So judicial, the law court. Deliberative, I think that's more of like the marketplace. And epideictic, I have to look that one up. But don't worry too much about that. And then there are different styles that Paul would have within his letters. Here are some of the major ones. Paranetic or paranesis is another word to say that. That's exhortation. And I will point that out, but basically those are the commands that Paul gives. It's called paranesis, commands, how the reader needs to act. Diatribe is a conversation between, a make-believe person. So, for example, in Romans, Paul will have someone say, well, what should we do then? Should we go on sinning? And what's Paul's answer? No way. And so Paul will ask questions that come from, like someone he's arguing with, a make-believe person, not a real person, but just a make-believe, kind of like the other perspective. And he argues with that person. And in that, he will give his answer. That's called diatribe. And that's very common, especially the first part of Romans. He uses a lot of that. He will introduce, he will have a letter of introduction, a recommendation, where he will introduce whoever is going to bring the letter to the church. Apologetic letter of self-commendation. This is where he defends himself. I should go back through these notes and give you examples, but I don't have time to do that right now. But for example, Galatians chapter 1, Paul defends himself. 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 12, Paul defends himself, and other places in that letter. And so that would be called a letter of apology. A family letter, ambassadorial letter, where he prepares the way for a visit. He does that in the book of Romans, chapter 15. He says he's planning to visit Rome on his way to Spain. A sermon or homily. We see this especially in First John, or the Epistle to the Hebrews. Those are more sermons than really a letter. But there are places within Paul's letters where it seems like he's giving a little sermon. A deliberative homily, you're trying to persuade, a sermon to persuade. And a midrash is a Hebrew word for commentary. There are places where Paul will give commentaries on Old Testament passages. For example, in the book of Romans, chapter 9, 10, and 11, he has a lot of quotations of the Old Testament, and then he gives a little commentary about those. Jews were very good at midrash. Actually, there's a whole other section I don't have in my notes here. I should include sometime. I keep adding to these notes. Maybe sometime I will add something here called Paul and Rabbinic Methods of Interpretation. Because many of Paul's letters follow, how would I say that? They follow the methods that ancient rabbis used. This has messed up my numbering. Anyway, I'll add that sometime. There we go. But that gets a little technical too, but a lot of how Paul wrote, he was following the methods of the rabbis at the time. And one of those methods is called midrash. So actually, that should go down here, but maybe the next version of my notes, I will add those. But there's 5 or 6 important ones that you can see in Paul's letters. Because Paul was a rabbi. He was schooled in rabbinic interpretation. The way he wrote, it didn't just like fall out of the sky. He was following the way he was taught. We can see that in a lot of passages. For example, he will have a string of quotations from the Old Testament. And for example, in Romans chapter 3, I think it is, he has a whole string of quotations. Pearl stringing is called, that are related to the same topic from different passages. And so he has, there's several of these, and I'll look them up, but you can also look them up if you're curious what they are. They're not important for us at this time. I do want to go on to the next topic, because the next topic is really important. And so we'll look at Paul's theology. Okay, so I'll just have to make a note to myself next time, work on that part. All right, so let's pause, and we'll take a short break too. But let me just give this whole section in summary, okay, in very simple terms. There's probably more here than you need to worry yourself about, but hopefully it's helpful background. If you're curious, you can go study more about that. So let me give a summary of this.